It doesn't take a major tragedy for something inside us to awaken. All it takes is a moment of lucidity, a moment in which we finally see clearly what we previously refused to accept. And when that happens, the reaction is not joy, but an urgent need to let go, to leave behind everything that no longer serves us, even though it may have been our only support for years. There are relationships, beliefs, and routines that were once a refuge. They helped us survive tough times. They gave us a certain emotional stability. Even when it hurt. But there comes a point when that same refuge turns into a prison. We stay there out of fear, out of habit, because of that absurd idea that letting go is losing. However, clinging to what has already fulfilled its function is also a way of losing oneself. Letting go is not always done out of courage. Many times it comes from exhaustion. When one can no longer hold on to something that weighs them down, an inner voice appears and says enough. And even though it hurts, giwa, that word is the beginning of freedom. Because not everything that was good in the past deserves a place in the present. There are relationships that become an echo of what they were, dynamics that wear us down, gestures that we repeat out of inertia. The problem is not having depended on someone or something. The conflict arises when we continue repeating that pattern, even though we know it is harming us. There is a kind of ancestral fear of emptiness, of that space that remains when we let go. We believe that this emptiness is a sign of loss, but sometimes it is just the prelude to a new stage. What hurts is not letting go. What hurts is resisting change. Most people do not fear the end, but the unknown that comes after. And yet, in that unknown lies the possibility of being different. Every duel, every breakup, every distance brings with it a silent opportunity, that of beginning to look at life from a different perspective. Not everything that sustained us deserves to continue sustaining us. What was once companionship can turn into a burden. What was affection into resignation. What was love into habit. And recognizing this is not coldness. Why? It is emotional maturity. Because maturing is not hardening, it is learning to choose without hatred. When one understands this, one begins to live with more awareness. One no longer reacts out of fear of being alone, but rather decides from a place of peace. And that is the beginning of true detachment, letting what has already served its time go without resentment, without drama, with the serenity of someone who has finally learned to look at their history with compassion. There are bonds that are born of love, but also many that are born of necessity. And that difference changes everything. When one bonds out of necessity, one confuses companionship with salvation, affection with anesthesia. Many times we do not choose the other out of real affinity, but because their presence soothes a wound that we do not know how to treat alone. And over time, that calm turns into dependence, and dependence into suffering. Some say that love can do everything, but that is not true. Love that is built on lack ends up demanding more than it can give. It is not a free love, it is a conditional love. I need you so that I do not fall. And the most painful thing is that sometimes we believe that total surrender is proof of nobility, when in reality it is a form of self-abandonment. Being good, without limits, is a subtle way of disappearing. We were taught that to love was to give everything, that giving in was a sign of generosity, that enduring was a sign of strength. But no one explained to us that there is also a healthy way of saying enough is enough, that setting a limit is not selfishness, it is self-respect. When love for another leads you to neglect yourself, it ceases to be love and becomes their emotional mission. In life, there comes a time when one has to ask oneself, how much of what I hold on to today is done out of fear and not out of conviction? How many of my relationships continue because I fear the tremors that change causes? Looking honestly hurts because it implies accepting that much of what we protect are emotional ruins that we idealize. We cling to familiar pains out of fear of a freedom that we do not yet know how to inhabit. Emotional maturity is not achieved by reading books or listening to advice. It appears when one dares to look at what hurts without glossing over it. When one stops justifying the unjustifiable and allows oneself to recognize that there are loves that have already fulfilled their cycle. Don't hate. Instead, understand that continuing is no longer appropriate. And in that understanding, there is a profound act of liberation. When we stop looking at the past as a debt and accept it as a learning experience, the present becomes fertile ground. Pain does not disappear overnight, but it is transformed. It ceases to be a chain and becomes mastery. Because sometimes suffering is not a sign of weakness, but the natural consequence of having loved more than the other person could receive. One learns that kindness, when it has no limits, becomes abandonment, and that true love, the kind that nourishes, begins with oneself. Loving another should not imply giving up one's own peace. And when one awakens to that awareness, one begins to choose differently, with less fear, with more clarity, with more respect for what one feels and needs. One of the deepest roots of human suffering is believing that others feel, think, and love in the same way as one does. This illusion makes us expect understanding where there is only distance, empathy where there is indifference, reciprocity where there is only desire. And every time this expectation is shattered, we feel that something inside is breaking. However, it is not treachery, but a loss of conscience. Not everyone has the same emotional depth or the same capacity to look inward. When we give more than we receive, we do not always do so out of generosity, but out of hope. We expect that when the other person sees our effort, they will respond in kind, and when they do not, we feel invisible, used, or insufficient. However, the problem is not in loving too much, but in not knowing when that love stops being reciprocated. Not everyone can love with the same intensity or with the same truth. And understanding this is a hard blow, arachi, but also liberating. Accepting that someone cannot offer us what we want is not resignation, it is emotional realism. It is not about molding the other person to fit in, but about consciously choosing who to walk with. Because something healthy cannot be built when one of the parties has not yet learned to see themselves. Not all relationships are reciprocal, and not all silences mean peace. Emotional maturity begins when we stop demanding from the other person what they never promised. When we understand that no one is obliged to feel the way we do or to value what we value, that is where freedom appears. And it is a freedom that does not shout, ra, that does not need to explain wa, that simply withdraws when it understands that insisting is wearing oneself out. This understanding does not come from pride, but from serenity. One stops insisting as, not because one has grown tired of the other person, but because one has grown tired of losing oneself. It is not about coldness, but about caring. Taking care of oneself is also an act of love, although sometimes it is misunderstood. There are times when walking away is not it is respect. Not everyone will be able to understand your gestures, your way of caring, your way of being present, and that's okay. You're not here to convince anyone of your worth. Respect is not begged for, it is given. And when it's not there, the right thing to do is take a step back. Because continuing in a place where people doubt who you are ends up breaking your identity. Acceptance is the point at which the wound stops bleeding and begins to heal. When you accept that the other person is not going to change, you regain power. You stop fighting battles that no longer make sense, and from that place you can look calmly, without resentment, understanding that life is not about converting anyone, but about learning to choose from awareness and not from lack. There is something profoundly liberating in no longer needing explanations, in understanding that closure does not always come in the form of conversation and apologies. Sometimes, silence is the only possible response. One insists, ori tries to clarify, justify, ori. Be understood until one understands that there are people who do not listen to understand, but to defend their version. And continuing to talk is just a way of prolonging the wound. There comes a time when tiredness weighs more than nostalgia. You realize that every attempt at dialogue becomes a dead end, that every word wears you down, that the energy you invest no longer generates connection, but rather more distance. So uffa, without making a sound, wuffa, you decide to withdraw, not to punish, but to take care of your emotional health. And that small and silent gesture becomes an internal revolution. Forgiving in silence is not coldness, it is maturity. It is understanding that not everything deserves to be explained, that not everything can be repaired with words. There are relationships that are exhausted to the point of not even leaving space for a goodbye. And when you get there, the healthiest thing is to keep trying, but to accept that the story has already given everything it could give. Letting go without hatred is a form of self-love. People often believe that forgiveness requires the other person, that it cannot be completed without their recognition. But true forgiveness is an intimate process. Hey, it's not about absolving anyone, but about freeing yourself from the weight of what's unresolved. Forgiving in silence is closing a chapter with dignity, without applause, without witnesses, without drama. It's about stopping wasting energy on resentments that only feed the past. That type of forgiveness doesn't seek reconciliation, it seeks peace. And peace isn't always understood by others. They may tell you that you're distant, that you've become cold, that you've lost your sensitivity, but only you know what it took you to get to this point. How often have you spoken unheard? How many chances given unanswered? Truly disheartening. Silence in those cases isn't revenge, it's the voice of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Sometimes not responding is the greatest act of respect one can have for oneself, not because there's a lack of arguments, but because you finally understand that your energy isn't infinite and that you can't keep defending yourself against someone who feeds off of conflict. Certain struggles aren't won. They're abandoned, not out of weakness, but wisdom. You don't choose to be silent because you have nothing to say. You understand that speaking to someone unwilling to listen is a betrayal of yourself. There's enormous strength in that decision, to remain silent. Because silence, when it comes from awareness, isn't empty. It's protection, it's a boundary, it's self-respect. Not everyone will understand the decisions you make when you start taking care of yourself. Some will call you selfish. Others will think you walked away for no reason. But no one, except you, knows what you had to go through to get to that point. The times you kept quiet so as not to argue, the nights you waited for a change that never came, the number of times you had to pull yourself together on your own. That's why, when you decide to remain silent and walk away, you don't need to justify it. Those who truly know you will understand. And those who don't will probably be part of what they no longer want to endure. When you stop responding to chaos, the world becomes clearer. You begin to see clearly what you used to tolerate out of habit. You discover that your peace is worth more than any unfinished conversation, and then silence ceases to be absence and becomes a refuge, because there are bonds that hurt even from a distance, but hurt much more when close. Learning to choose between the two is one of the most difficult tests of emotional maturity. Silence in these cases is not indifference, it is a limit. It is the soul's way of saying enough is enough, not because there is a lack of love, but because there is too much wear and tear. And the hardest part about this process is that no one usually applauds it. From the outside, it may seem exaggerated or radical, but only those who have experienced the confusion and exhaustion of trying to sustain the unsustainable know how necessary it is to stop. When you understand this, you no longer seek to convince anyone of your truth. You no longer need to have the last word. You simply choose serenity over reason, calm over confrontation, and that choice, even if it seems small, transforms your entire life. You stop living on the defensive and begin to live coherently. There are relationships, jobs, even family environments that constantly invite you to justify yourself, to explain what you feel, to defend what you do. And there comes a point when you ask yourself, what for? What part of me continues to seek approval where there is only judgment? When you understand that respect is not begged for, you discover true peace. Not because everything around you changes, but because you change the way you are in the world. That silent peace does not need grand gestures. It is noticeable in everyday details, in the way you breathe, in how you organize your space, in how you speak to yourself. Self-respect begins there. In the simple, in the intimate, taking care of yourself is not a fad or a superficial act. It is a profound declaration of love towards yourself. It is telling yourself, I will not continue living in places that fragment me. And when you begin to honor yourself in the daily yao, something inside falls into place. The energy becomes clear. The choices become firm. The presence becomes more serene. From that state, you no longer need to ask for respect. It becomes a natural consequence of your coherence. There are absences that hurt not because of who the person was, but because of what they represented in our history. Sometimes we miss the feeling we had when we were with someone more than the person themselves. And that is what confuses us. We think that echo of tenderness is a sign that we should return, when in reality it is just emotional memory repeating what was experienced. Nostalgia has that trick. It illuminates the past with a soft light that disguises the cracks, erases the pain, and exaggerates the good. And if one is not careful, one ends up wanting to return to a place that no longer exists. Emotionally maturing involves seeing the whole story, not just the fragments that console. Insisting on what has already been broken just for fear of emptiness is a way of denying oneself the possibility of a healthier life. Letting go does not mean denying what was felt or despising what was experienced. It means recognizing that what once made sense no longer does today. It is an act of honesty, not coldness. You can remember with affection without the need to go back. You can miss them and at the same time choose distance. Because when promises become repeated apologies and caresses become excuses, something inside begins to pay off. Staying there out of habit or attachment is no longer love, it is resistance. And no one should stay in one place alone for fear of the unknown. True transformation does not happen when the other person changes, but when one decides to stop negotiating their well-being, and that decision is often made in silence. There is no need for a scene or a dramatic farewell. Sometimes the most powerful act is to calmly withdraw, with the certainty that there is nothing else to do. In that silence, there is firmness, dignity, self-love. Every time nostalgia knocks on your door, ask yourself if what you miss is the person or the idea of what you wanted them to be. Would you be willing to relive the entire cycle, not just the good parts? If the answer is no, then let go with gratitude. It is not about forgetting, but about not returning to the same place, expecting a different ending. Being honest with yourself is one of the most profound acts of emotional freedom, but that honesty comes at a price. It could push you away from people, could make you uncomfortable, could leave you alone for a bit. Even so, it is worth it because what is lost in quantity is gained in quality. Living from truth is losing what is unnecessary to keep what is essential. There is no greater peace than living without contradiction between what you feel and what you do. If you achieve that, no further explanation is needed. You simply live in coherence, and that coherence is felt, noticed, transmitted. Notice, it does not shout, it does not impose, it simply is. Well, and that is the type of presence that begins to bring only what vibrates at the same frequency. Authenticity has a cost, but also an enormous reward. The peace of mind, of knowing that you are no longer acting to please. When you decide to stop molding yourself to fit in, the world falls into place, and although you lose some connections, you gain something much more valuable, the peace of being coherent with yourself. Most people don't realize how exhausting it is to constantly edit themselves, moderating every gesture so as not to cause discomfort. Over time, this self-censorship disconnects you and makes you a stranger to yourself. Being authentic doesn't mean being perfect or having all the answers. It means daring to be honest, even when it makes you uncomfortable. Not saying what you think with respect, but without fear. Showing what you feel without turning it into a spectacle. It's not about imposing your truth, but about living it. And living it involves upholding it even when your surroundings don't validate it. Emotional discipline comes precisely from there. From the ability to act based on who you choose to be and not based on what others provoke in you. Because without that internal structure, you end up reacting from the wound, not from your conscience. You scream when you should be quiet. You stay when you should leave. You explain when silence would suffice. So, little by little, you distance yourself. Self-examination without excuses is a tough personal growth exercise. It involves recognizing the places from which you still operate out of fear, lack, or the need for approval. But that recognition is not condemnation. It is a gateway. Constant self-observation is the path to clarity. And with clarity, relationships change because you stop choosing who fills your voids and start building with those who share your truth. It is no coincidence that when one begins to live from authenticity, the circle narrows. The people who remain are those who truly see you. And although loneliness appears at some points along the way, it stops being scary, because loneliness inhabited with dignity does not hurt. On the contrary, it heals. In it, you find space to listen to yourself, to understand your own rhythms, to discover what you truly need. Being alone for a while is not a failure. It is a way of reconnecting. When you learn to be at peace with yourself, relationships stop being a refuge and become a choice. You no longer seek someone to save you, but someone to walk with you in freedom. And that difference changes everything. Being strong doesn't mean not needing anyone. It's being able to support yourself when no one else does, but also having the humility to ask for help when you can take it anymore. True strength combines independence with openness, because it's not about closing your heart off, but about taking care of its access. Not everyone deserves to enter your most intimate spaces. Only those who know how to care without imposing, accompany without invading. Not everyone around you is prepared to accompany you in your processes. Certain people are only present when you shine, not when you heal. Others are uncomfortable with your silence, with your limits, with your need for calm, and learning to distinguish between those who can support you and those who only distract you from the emptiness is one of the greatest tests of growth. Not everyone deserves to have access to your vulnerability. Your inner world is not a public space. It is an intimate territory that only those who understand its value should inhabit. True happiness does not appear as a distant goal, but as a silent daily work. It is not something that is sought outside, but something that is built within. It appears in those small acts that seem insignificant. Tidying up a corner, taking care of your body, choosing who you share your day with, turning off what upsets you. See? Allowing yourself to rest without guilt. Each of these gestures is a way of telling yourself, I care about myself. When you stop to think about it, you discover that most of the time it's not the world that steals your peace, but the way you relate to it. You wear yourself out trying to change what doesn't depend on you, seeking recognition where there is none, expecting understanding in places where there is only judgment. Turning your gaze inward is not selfishness. It is emotional responsibility. It is taking charge of yourself without waiting for someone else to come and organize your chaos. There is a form of forgiveness that doesn't need words. It is that silent forgiveness that is born when you decide to stop feeding the wound. It is not about reconciling or justifying what was done to you, but about releasing the energy that you keep tied to resentment. Forgiveness, in its purest form, does not always open doors. Sometimes it closes them forever. Not from a lack of love, but from an excess of conscience. Letting go does not erase the past. It resignifies it. You stop carrying it around like a cross to integrate it as an experience. What happened happened, and you don't need to forget it to move forward. You can remember it without it hurting, because you don't relive it anymore. That's the difference between healing and pretending nothing happened. When something heals, it stops controlling your present. Walking away in that context is not abandonment, it's respect. Respect for yourself, for your process, for your need for peace. Not all relationships are meant to last. It's not about affection, but rather their detrimental impact on your well-being. Sometimes, the most loving act you can have with someone is to leave, so as not to continue hurting or harming them. And although from the outside it may seem cold, it's actually the most honest way to love without destroying yourself. Forgiving in silence is reclaiming power over your own story. It is to cease being a victim of what was done to you and to once again become the author of what you choose to live. It's not about forgetting or minimizing but about telling yourself, I'm no longer going to use my energy to hold on to this pain in that moment. Something changes forever. Because when you decide to no longer carry what you can't change, there's room for peace. There comes a time in life when you realize that you're not here for others to make you happy. Do you understand that your purpose is not to fill voids with someone's presence or to build your identity based on how they look at you? Sometimes you discover too late that fulfillment isn't found. It's built, that it's not about accumulating connections, but about inhabiting yourself with integrity. And when you achieve that, wajah, you no longer seek to complete yourself through the other, but rather to share yourself from the whole. Being strong isn't about not feeling or closing the doors of your soul. It's having the fortitude to walk alone when company stops being a shelter and becomes a burden. It's staying the course, even when fear whispers to you to turn back. But it's also recognizing your limits, knowing when to ask for help, when to say, I can't do it anymore. True strength does not exclude vulnerability. It embraces it with humility. Emotional wisdom is not about controlling everything, but about discernment, knowing when to move forward, when to stop, when to let go. Because not every battle needs to be won. Some just need to be understood. And not all silence is empty. There are silences that heal, that organize, that give meaning. In that space where you stop fighting and start listening, something appears that the noise had always covered up. Peace. That peace is not a fleeting emotion. It is a state of being. It comes from being in coherence with what you feel, what you think, and what you do. It does not depend on your environment or circumstances, but on your way of living. Happiness understood in this way is not euphoria or promise. It is stability. You can look back on your life with triumphs and wounds and still feel at peace within. When someone tells you, no one will ever love you like I do, remember that love is not measured by intensity, but by well-being. And if someone threatens you with regret for leaving, Remember that staying in a place that breaks you was never love. It was fear. True love does not demand that you lose yourself. It invites you to do. If you have reached this point, if you recognize deep within yourself that you can no longer negotiate your peace, then the path is clear. It is no longer about answers or explanations. What you need now is silence, presence, and the certainty, perhaps fragile but true, that you will not betray yourself from now on. Everything that comes will have to find you complete, not perfect, not immune, but honest with yourself. And that honesty, that serene peace that comes from choosing yourself will be enough, because life in the end is not about winning or losing, but about living with dignity, in harmony with who you are and with what you have already decided to leave behind. Yeah,